The anarchist proposals. The new parties of the left, from Podemos to Barcelona en Comú, arose from the death of the 15M movement. At least in Barcelona and Madrid, anarchist participation helped beat the left-wing parties and the grassroots politicians in their efforts to centralize the movement and use it exclusively to exercise an institutional pressure. Yes, part of the movement organized marches to Madrid and Brussels to demand constitutional reform, but in general, the rejection of political parties was maintained. The majority of its energies were channeled into more direct protests, and, at least in Barcelona, the movement was rerouted to the neighborhood assemblies and other spaces that were more difficult to centralize. And the neighborhood assemblies formed part of a great laboratory for the radicalization of strikes, support for struggles that previously had been partial and isolated, the definitive defeat of pacifism, and the improvement of methods of communication, dissemination, and assemblies. The grassroots politicians were not able to capture the movement nor make use of its structures. They created their new parties after the death of the movement in the plazas. These parties have fed precisely off the popular disappointment that the entire movement hadn't accomplished anything. As such, we could say that the anarchists were successful in negating the maneuvers for the institutionalization of the struggles, but we met with a sound defeat when it came to introducing our proposals in the emerging social spaces. Some of us were ashamed of our oh-so-daring ideas, and others lacked visions and proposals to begin with. Others, who tried to come off as the most radical, were so fragile that they did not even know how to express and put in practice their ideas in spaces where there were also opposing ideas. Did they think that anarchist ideas cannot defend themselves when they enter into contact with reformist ideas? They surrendered the new spaces to the reformists without even putting up a fight. It was an important achievement that many of those assemblies did not become centralized spaces of unitary decision-making capable of representing and controlling an entire movement. But we did not know how to formulate anarchist proposals that could also be useful to other people in the decentralized assemblies we had helped create. Footnote: when I refer to proposals that could be useful to other people, I am not talking about charity projects that we, the good anarchists, do for strangers, but about proposals that could be useful for us and others. It seems that, rejecting charity, we don't know how to do anything with other people if they don't also start identifying as anarchists. And it is a sad shortcoming, because there is a huge gap between charity and recruitment. End footnote. In the end, the institutionalizers of the struggles won the conflict, though they had to wait 2 more years, between the death of the 15M movement and the rise of the new parties. We achieved, and not thanks to us, but thanks to the latent anarchic capacities in all people, a first step towards the self-organization of society. But people, and not without reason, chafed at the uselessness of the autonomous assemblies. Subsequently, and this time lacking reason, they placed their hopes once more in the democratic structures, this time betting on new representatives and new parties. Without a doubt, it is not our responsibility, as enlightened ones, to show people how they have to organize their lives, nor make use of assemblies. But we live in a world in which all structural pressures inhibit us from practicing self-organization and redirect us towards representation and passivity. If we, the anarchists, who spend every day thinking about these things, were not capable of conceiving nor putting in practice those multitudinous spaces, the proposals that correspond to our own desires and necessities, how can we blame anyone else for not having done so? And I don't want to hear the individualist or anti-socialist comrades say that they have no need of multitudinous spaces, because they, with their own forces, have not been able to realize their desires nor defeat the state. I would refer them to proven and consequential individualists and anti-socials like Renzo Novatore, who had a more nuanced and real posture, rather than a dogmatic defeatist one, regarding relations with the hated masses. What might the anarchist proposals for self-organization have been? From a hypothetical standpoint, it is impossible to give the most intelligent responses to this question. Only on the basis of practice and collective intelligence could the most suitable paths be developed. But we can offer at least a few suggestions in order to leave the realm of abstraction. The experience of the mutual aid networks, a model of collective pressure in response to housing and labor problems, developed in Seattle and appearing first, among the iterations in the Spanish state, in the Barcelona neighborhood of Clot, was interesting. It gave rise to a few small but important battles, but in the end only demonstrated the lack of patience generalized among anarchists and the great difficulty, in today's society, of avoiding dynamics of assistentialism, or charity. The majority of groups of this type gave up after a short time, instead carrying out an intense work in the neighborhoods in order to find other people with economic problems and a desire to resist. The Platform for People Affected by Mortgages, or PAH, had much more success in this sense, but often at the cost of obstructing any advance in their own struggle. We're referring to reformist demands and visions, criminalizing and unsolidaristic discourses towards other ways of struggle, the use of self-defense and riots against evictions, the squatting of houses that don't belong to the banks, and a refusal to critique private property or include people who rent. The minoritarian Platform for People Affected by Mortgages and Capitalism, or PAHC, overcame some of these limitations, but the organization as a whole has ended up with few possibilities outside of the electoral path. And it has very few legalist perspectives, given that very few anarchists, and I must include myself, participated in this organization of direct action and reformist discourses. Within a larger space like the assembly of a city or a neighborhood, there existed the possibility, untested, of transforming this model so that it leaves behind the traits of a specialized activist group and adopts more radical and combative characteristics. In another time, the example of the auto reductions in the proletarian neighborhoods of Italy in the 60s and 70s was very important. It would have been an interesting model. If they cut back our social services, instead of demanding change in the arena of the laws, we will install our own cutbacks, not paying sales tax or public transport, only paying half for the gas, water, and electricity, for rent, etc. A broad space would have been ideal for organizing initiatives of this type, but in general it was not done. The matters of misery and precarity were left to be dealt with by each individual in an isolated fashion. Yes, there were mobilizations in Barcelona against the price hikes in public transport, but the response was dominated by a reformist assembly that we anarchists were not capable of contradicting, even though we were among the most active organizers of the successive campaigns in the metro and the bus lines. Besides a few occasional protests, the proposal of free public transport was only spread on the level of propaganda and not of action. And there we lost ourselves in questions that were very important, but at least at the moment hardly useful, regarding the anarchist city. Would it exist? And the ideal transport. Would there be any? The few times we proposed free transport, we hardly believed it ourselves, given that we weren't convinced that cities and metros would exist in our ideal world, nor had we had that conversation, the one about revolution, with our neighbors and new comrades. In our own eyes, we were impractical dreamers, so we bit our tongues even as we made our proposals. We didn't propose a refusal to pay, not during occasional protests, but every day, as a form of counterattack, and we didn't understand the assemblies as spaces to propose and organize such measures. All the elements for a successful struggle in the metro and bus existed. New technologies for visibilizing and evading ticket controls, associations or solidaristic insurance to collectively pay fines, popular rage against the price hikes and the touristification, precaritization, and gentrification that had become generalized in the city, assemblies in every neighborhood to organize proposals outside the control of political parties and negotiation-oriented platforms, and there was also still a diffuse capacity for sabotage. It would have been possible to link it up with the struggle against borders, given the complicity of metro security guards in identifying or beating up migrants, and the struggle against the expansion of social control, given the planned implementation of an integrated system of tracking and surveillance throughout the whole public transport network. It could have taken the form of sabotage against the technologies of control in the metro, the opening of stations, putting the ticket machines out of service, and massive propaganda advocating a refusal to pay, an action that is beneficial for everyone, that encourages illegality, and that is not directed at negotiation with the authorities. Instead of this, there are occasional protests that block the lines of transport, only angering people who didn't want to spend even more time commuting, and the only objective was to pressure TMB, the Metropolitan Transport Administration, and City Hall to implement a change. A successful campaign of this kind might have served as a step towards that great event, the rent strike. Such a strike demands much more commitment than any one-day general strike. It weaves stronger connections of solidarity between its participants, and it also generates opportunities for combat, which is perhaps the only advantage of the spectacular general strikes, given that neighbors will have to defend against the inevitable evictions. Yes, a rent strike is very far off, but not so far as the revolution. What is lacking is not possibility, but seriousness. Parallel to these activities for the construction of collective power and immediate counterattack against immiseration, more ideal activities were also lacking, focused on creating spaces of our own where the social relations we want can begin to flourish. Occupied plazas and gardens, networks of exchange and gifts, workshops for artisanal skills. In this line, we do have some examples, like the Athenaeum in Poble Sec or the Agora of Juan Andres in Raval. The two projects have significantly increased the intensity and the possibilities of struggle in those zones, but their recognition as important examples has not been very widespread. Then, there are always those projects and activities, destructive as well as constructive, that only arise from anarchist groups organized along lines of affinity. These are indispensable, but if they are not accompanied by a parallel labor in broad, heterogeneous spaces, they will become isolated and enjoy small chance of attaining their objectives. In summation, people do not distance themselves from anarchism because they believe status dogma. They believe status dogma because they are obliged to reproduce it. For most people, beliefs do not determine actions. Actions determine beliefs. They will believe that which is most comfortable for them to believe as long as they must live under the impositions of the state. Up against a prison society, anarchism will not be spread with better or more propaganda. It will spread if it can exercise force against the dominant structures, if it can put in practice, at least in a limited way, its ideas, and if these ideas are applicable to people's daily lives. The first people in a society who raise the anarchist banner are dreamers, but we are not so unique. We tend to be more sensitive, in one way or another, and for us, anarchism is useful from the outset because we cannot stand life in the society with its lies and impositions. Anarchism fulfills our psychosocial needs. Other people are not blind to these lies and impositions, they just endure them and invent the appropriate excuses. The need for physical survival is one of the strongest and most reasonable arguments there is, and today, it is the state that guarantees people's survival. Populism and revolutionary suicide. Neither the activities of the affinity groups nor practical proposals in heterogeneous spaces have constituted the greatest effort carried out by many anarchists these last years. On the contrary, ever more comrades are dedicating themselves to revolutionary suicide. It seems to us that the greatest problem faced by anarchism today is populism. If we place our chips on the tension between the social and antisocial needs of the struggle, we will recognize that self-isolation is the curse of those comrades who fail to overcome the contradictions of the antisocial position, and populism is the curse of those who fail to overcome the contradictions of the social position. If the new left-wing parties are the consequence of the death of the movements against austerity outside the anarchist space, within the anarchist space the consequence is populism. One can perceive an anxiety, a panic, in reaction to the electoral successes of certain activists who previously had been in assemblies or protests with us. Those trapped in an antisocial position react to the predictable, eternal dynamic of institutionalization by seeking to isolate themselves even further. If certain people in the heterogeneous movements against austerity, or before that against globalization, are now in politics, they seize on this mundane tragedy as a meager proof that participating in such movements was a mistake. In this way, they demonstrate the fragility of their position and the lack of radicality in their vision. Leftists, simply by acting as leftists, can drive them away from social conflicts, which are always messy, always complex, and always attract opportunists, institutionalizers, and other unsavory figures. Those who wear the mantle of the most radical are seeking pure spaces of antagonism that do not exist, because they do not know how to defend radical ideas and practices in heterogeneous spaces. The populists, on the other hand, feel their isolation, but they do not understand its roots. With an array of mistaken methods founded on chronic weakness and an historical amnesia that is really quite tragic, populist anarchists fall into an unstoppable route, which they call connecting with the masses. The majority of populists I know have less contact with people outside the ghetto than the typical antisocial anarchist. I have seen some of them fail as insurrectionalists, and now they are failing as organizers of the masses. They have not connected with the people in the least. Nonetheless, they are obsessed with leaving the ghetto, and they inflate themselves with the idea that they are more dedicated than other anarchists, those of us who remain in the ghetto. To begin with, they don't understand what the ghetto is, nor where it comes from. We cannot be more categorical. The ghetto is constructed solely by the state. Not grasping this basic fact is to completely obviate the nature of present-day society. For them, the ghetto means living in a squat because it's cool, wearing black, going to occasional protests and talks, and partying, drinking cheap beers, and gratuitously sniffing speed in one of the typical spaces of our milieu. But we don't all have the same experience. Some of us started squatting because we couldn't afford rent. Some of us wear the clothes we were able to dumpster or steal. Some of us don't go to parties, we don't insult our bodies with drugs, and we happen to know our neighbors. I have friends who rent and work normal jobs, and they are also in the ghetto, just like me. What then is the ghetto? It is having to lie about who we are so we don't get fired from our jobs. It is having to hide the details of our lives when we speak with strangers. It is having to pretend to be normal people when we look for an apartment, fill out paperwork, or cross borders. It is knowing that they can label us as terrorists and put us in prison. Those are the walls of our ghetto. They are social structures that control us, punish us, and isolate us. It strikes me as myopic that the populist comrades don't realize this. It is a sign of a grave lack of seriousness, a position of comfort, that they have never sought out the true walls of their prison. And as an aside, yes, it makes perfect sense to speak of normal people in reference to a category from which we are excluded. The normal person is the normalized person, the one who follows society's norms. Being an anarchist is not normal. And what do they do with people who don't follow the norms of their society? That's right, they stick them in the ghetto. We can decorate the walls of our ghetto and even put up nice tiles or posters to make it more cozy, as many aesthetic rebels do, or we can punch holes in it to pass secret messages back and forth. But it is completely erroneous to think that we are the ones who built this ghetto. As long as capitalism exists, the ghetto will also exist. It is nothing less than an integral structure of the society of the spectacle and the state itself. The populists are not breaking out of their isolation. In fact, outside the ghetto, people are much more isolated than inside. Within, practices of solidarity and mutual aid are much more vibrant than in normalized society. Until the revolution comes, there's only one way out of the ghetto, and that is by obeying society's norms. And it seems that this is what the populist comrades are starting to do. Populism demonstrates the abandonment of radical practices. The representatives of various initiatives for mass organization in the Barcelona Anarchist Book Fair in 2015 knew how to disguise their words in order to avoid saying anything alarming. They insisted that they were not watering down their discourse or their practices, while they constantly advocated a drastic dilution in order to connect with the masses. But several of their followers, who did not know how to watch their mouths like good politicians, made a direct link between leaving the ghetto and abandoning self-organization in order to advocate working with public institutions. In recent years, speaking of an abandonment of principles, we have seen a new wager on municipalism from left-wing parties, organizations, and platforms like the CUP, Iran, or Barcelona en Comú, and also from libertarian groups like MBAT. For the left, this move makes perfect sense. They need to find a new mask, a new aroma, so that the corpse of institutional struggle which they've never given up on dragging behind them can appear alive again after so many deaths. But why would anarchists encourage this method? Municipalism is the perfect bridge between a social movement and its self-betrayal. It is just another path to institutionalization. The conquest of a municipality is a delusion. Activities of state management on the municipal level are no less alienating for their proximity. Methods of political alienation, methods based in authority and obedience, do not change their essence if the political body contains 100 million or 10,000 people. The city-states of ancient Greece usually consisted of fewer people than the typical municipality today, and they were capable of organizing the systems of slavery, punishment, execution, and patriarchy, exploitative commerce, and welfare. In fact, the majority of early states were nothing more than municipalities. The municipalists have no examples of truly revolutionary successes other than Rojava. But Rojava has nothing in common with the municipalism of Bookchin or that of the CUP. They did not achieve autonomy necessary for beginning their experiment through a gradual process of protests and elections, but rather through a civil war in which they disposed of a large army. And, if the Kurds managed to liberate part of their territory in the long term, they will only have created a state that is much more decentralized than the typical bureaucratic butcher shop of the Marxist-Leninists. In the near future, they will still have to resolve the contradiction between the inherent tendencies of centralized structures to constantly increase the centralization of power and their desire for freedom. Either they will create a new state, a new system of domination, or they will abolish it completely. We don't deign to tell them how they should organize themselves to overcome this contradiction. We don't know the answer. But any person on this planet can affirm, with good reason, that states cannot be reformed. They are destroyed, or they dominate you. A supposedly revolutionary municipalism has no historical argumentation. It is founded in weakness, in the failure of other practices of struggle, and in the lack of visions for how to proceed. Another practice abandoned by some of the populist anarchists is solidarity. In response to the waves of repression between 2013 and 2015, which has resulted in a total of 68 anarchists arrested as terrorists in the whole country, many people have stood in solidarity despite the chance that they might be the next to be taken. But some assemblies and organizations, from what I have seen always of a populist character, have distanced themselves from those repressed, refused to give support, and even justified the repression. It should be said that many sectors of the Catalan independence movement were more solidaristic than those anarchists. Connected with their rejection of solidarity, there is also a distancing, generalized amongst nearly all the populists, from combative practices. In a press conference convened by various anarcho-populist formations after the arrests of the second phase of Operation Pandora in October 2015, the spokespersons articulated what was and what was not anarchism, and the capitalist media amplified their imbecile and unsolidaristic discourses. They rejected, quote, violence. In the end, they attained their own pacification. The last medium that remains to them is propaganda, but lacking force and solidarity, the only thing they can disseminate are empty ideas. When they take on the task of communication, populist anarchists appropriate the techniques of marketing without any scruple or historical analysis. It's helpful to be acquainted with the science of marketing and public relations as techniques for the control of masses, but it is completely incoherent for anarchists to make use of such techniques. To clarify our rejection of marketing, we should clarify what it is and what it isn't. Rejecting it doesn't mean denying the importance of aesthetics, of good design, and good layout, of well-elaborated propaganda techniques. There's a fundamental difference. Anarchist communication starts with an idea that we want to communicate. Subsequently, we seek the most adequate format to communicate that idea. On the contrary, the practice of marketing subordinates the content to the form because its fundamental objective is not the propagation of an idea, but the selling of a product, whether it is a new car or the anarchist brand, a ghastly expression I have heard uttered by a number of populist comrades. The propaganda produced by marketing has to be attractive and easy to digest. These two practices are completely incompatible. Marketing is not capable of disseminating profound ideas and critiques, which are the only ones with any chance of helping us change this world with its complex systems of domination. Marketing is designed to sell something, whatever bullshit, in large quantities. We have seen how populist comrades have complained that texts were too long, in cases of skillfully laid out pamphlets, with a good distribution of space and text written elegantly, lacking any superfluity. They did not suggest seeking a more adequate format for the text, nor a correction of the text that would allow it to communicate the same ideas in fewer words. I repeat that the formats and the texts were impeccable. What they wanted was to impose an implicit prohibition in texts too long to fit in a tweet. They are accomplices to the infantilization of their audiences and the atrophy of their own intellectual capacities. Let's consider a concrete example. We can forget about that useless verbiage that certain populist groups spew out on Twitter in order to briefly analyze one of the highest quality propaganda projects of all the populist formations, Hola Dictadura, a magazine that speaks about the use of the anti-terrorism laws. It is already apparent that the present text is full of very strong criticisms, but the aim is not to fling shit or provoke cheap feuds. It is also necessary to give praise where praise is due. Hola Dictadura reveals a high level of design and preparation. It is evident that its authors dedicated time and effort. If only all anarchist propaganda were prepared with such dedication, ability, and seriousness. But if we only analyze the magazine itself, divorced from the pacified and pro-capitalist practice of the populists, there are still some criticisms to be made. It is noticeable that the authors subordinated the communication of ideas to the demands of marketing, being attractive, being easy to digest. Hola Dictadura contains very simple ideas, scant information, and less analysis. It gives the reader the sensation that they are reading off the screen of a smartphone. It looks like one of those Yankee magazines for brainless patriots, like Time. The content of Hola Dictadura is without a doubt much better than that of Time. In truth, it would be great if everyone in the world read it. There would be much less support for the politics of anti-terrorism. But in the end, the critiques they communicate are only progressive. There are no anarchist critiques of anti-terrorism, which means that all the ideas presented in the magazine support democratic values. There is a reason for this. Anarchist ideas are more complicated to explain and a little more difficult to accept, because all the education and information people have absorbed throughout their lives is produced by various social structures to support the fundamental beliefs of the state, patriarchy, and capitalism. It is much easier to use progressive arguments against anti-terrorism if you want to convince people quickly. But, faced with a movement animated by such arguments, the state would have no problem redirecting or recuperating it via a reform, because there are not radical critiques that get to the root of the problem. It's not a question of an identitarian rejection. The problem isn't that the magazine isn't printed in all black, with a bad layout full of circle A's and references to the state and capital. The problem is that it betrays itself. It opts for the easy way that the state already knows how to control, that doesn't contain the depth necessary to develop an intelligent struggle. A better familiarity with history would veto any anarchist's wager on marketing. It is not difficult to discover the origins of this profession. It is widely known that the father of marketing and public relations was Edward Bernays, an important advisor to a dozen presidents and global corporations. Any awareness of his work makes it clear that it is exclusively a question of the manipulation of the masses. History also offers us other episodes that the populists ignore, either by laziness or by choice. Bernays invented the philosophy and science of public relations, but he was not the one who invented many of the specific techniques. Today's populists are not the first to try to use aesthetic methods to spread their ideas and change the world. Early in the 20th century, the Dadaists already tried to make a revolution through subversive communication, and they did it with much more intelligence, creativity, and dedication. And it was a grand failure. But the capitalist companies took note and appropriated the Dadaists' techniques. Their aesthetic advances, their methods of communication, proved to be more effective when linked with capitalist processes, utilized for the sale of products rather than as a revolutionary seduction. The innovative Russian artist Rodchenko suffered a similar destiny, with his works appropriated by the Bolshevik authorities and later by the public relations industry in the West. The marketing mania is only justified by the unexamined weakness of the populists. They can tell they are alone, but they have not understood the social structures that provoke their isolation, and they have no revolutionary projectuality to break those structures. What they seek to do is recruit. In order to criticize the practice of recruitment, it could be fruitful to take the example of the FAC, the Anarchist Federation of Catalonia. It must be said that this organization is heterogeneous, and it would be unfair to label it as populist, though it contains populist elements. It must also be said that their campaign of introduction, to announce the creation of the Federation and present it throughout Catalonia, in which we can spot populist dynamics, was carried out with a praiseworthy energy and enthusiasm. We would be in a better position if every open anarchist project pushed itself as much to invite collaboration and open itself up to participation. But it is necessary to make a criticism of the poster and video they published with this campaign, under the slogan, "Do you think you might be an anarchist?" The materials used in their introduction don't make a serious reference to social conflicts, to the realities of struggle, nor to the enormous challenge we anarchists are faced with. On the contrary, it calls on the public to identify as anarchists, seeking complicity without risks, without a depth of ideas, without strong commitments, without a process of total transformation. And I'm not even referring to the transformation of the world as much as to the personal transformation that all of us have had to go through to become anarchists. Sure, in a poster or video, one cannot communicate everything, but it can be made plain that there exists deeper critiques, risk, conflict. Propaganda can be an invitation to seek, to investigate, to plumb the depths, to begin a process of transformation. But recruitment does not aim for any of this. The introductory materials of the FAC fall into the demands of marketing, being attractive and being easy to digest. Going to prison isn't attractive. Getting beaten by police isn't attractive. Spending hours on end in assemblies isn't attractive. Years and decades of defeat are not attractive. As such, they are left out of the vision of anarchism that the populists present. Only based on these materials, my grandmother could be considered an anarchist. My grandmother is not an anarchist. It's not a problem. She's a great person, and I love her a lot, but she's a far cry from a comrade. Though she thinks self-organization and resistance to injustice are great, she doesn't want to dedicate herself to the destruction of the state, and she won't support the people committed to this project in the medium or long term. We don't win anything with illusory alliances and complicities. We must ask, what kind of person would be recruited with such an attractive vision of anarchism? People who distance themselves from the struggle as soon as the police start breaking down doors in the early morning and taking our comrades away in handcuffs? People who let themselves get swept along to vote in elections and enter into municipal institutions? People who are not in any process of self-education, of profound study and critique, who don't understand how the world they live in works, nor where to find the roots of oppression? And if we recruit using superficial propaganda, what are the advantages of a large organization, inflated with people who have unrealistic expectations and a total ignorance of the history of struggle? Delivering such criticisms, I've only encountered evasions. Contrary to such evasions, it is not a question of being many anarchists or being few. The majority of populist formations are as small as a gathering of affinity groups, or smaller. Often, the obsession with recruiting or creating a large anarchist organization, or, quote, capacity for mobilization, is nothing but a substitute that hides an absolute lack of struggles on our own. In struggle, we deepen our ideas and practices, and we encounter new comrades, new complicities. It is often the people who have no struggle in their daily life, who don't know how to find social conflicts, who propose creating large organizations based on recruitment, or creating a mobilizing capacity based on seductive techniques of communication. Anarchist organization. A large part of the initiatives for anarchist organization that we have seen fail over the last years were suffocated by people who did not have their own projectuality, who did not know how to find and develop their own struggles, who demanded that the organization itself be a space for generating struggles. But struggles are not created by a set of initials. Struggles are born in the streets. Organizations either serve to coordinate and amplify an activity that already exists, or they don't serve for anything at all. As the comrades of the MIL said, organization is the organization of the tasks of the struggle. As such, the necessity for organization depends on the density of anarchist activity in a place or region. The most basic unit that conforms an anarchist density is the project. Individual projects tend to organize themselves. In this category, we find social centers, action groups, propaganda groups, publications, groups of workers, gardens, assemblies, feminist initiatives, groups of self-defense and training, etc. Ideally, they choose the structures and the level of formality or informality that best fits their project, free of dogmas or prefabricated schemas. They can use formal consensus, informal consensus, the separation of tasks and functions, delegation, and even voting if they know how to protect themselves from the danger of majorities. A project might also be the initiative of an individual who looks for ad hoc complicity and collaboration, as is the case with a disproportionate number of small projects with the greatest quality and duration. Among all these options, informality favors trust, affinity, and a fluid and rapid functioning. Formality facilitates the creation of a space that is accessible for new people and also facilitates a change in internal dynamics, if there exists a decisive will to carry it out. This last point is highly important. When we speak of internal dynamics that a group might want to change, we are thinking of things like irresponsibility and lack of commitment, lack of self-criticism, hierarchy, sexist behaviors, etc. There are many who think that a formal structure in and of itself can change or overcome the internal dynamic of a group. This is completely false. As democracy well demonstrates, at large or small scale, formal structures also serve to hide unwanted dynamics or to generate the illusion that the problem is being solved. The most important element is always the culture of the group, which is reproduced above all in informal spaces. It is vital to understand that there is no dichotomy, symmetry, or congruence between these two terms. The informal always surpasses the formal. There is no formal structure capable of replacing informal space. Not even the most bureaucratic state is free of informal spaces and relations. In fact, it is within informal channels that the power legitimized and hidden by formal structures often moves. This is because reality itself is informal. An uncritical rationalism among certain anarchists has made them forget that the universe is chaotic, and this is one of the few advantages we have against the state. So, in order to change unfortunate dynamics, the most important thing is for the group to have a decisive will to do it. Approving a formal structure to solve the problem is just a way to wash one's hands of it. Nonetheless, formal structures can serve as tools, if the necessary will is really present, because they oblige us to break with our habitual patterns and behaviors, which are often unexamined. Formal structures can facilitate the entry of new people, which might not be the objective of the project, making it clear that the group is not just a closed circle of friends. But also, if they are excessive, they can scare off new people, given the appearance of a sect or bureaucratic party. A very isolated group, for example in a country or region with few anarchists, can make use of formality to facilitate contact with other isolated people who are looking for companions, or contact with comrades in other countries. In heterogeneous and intergenerational assemblies, informality is normally better if it is not a space for making unitary decisions, because informality generates an environment of familiarity and trust, and normally it is the young political animals who most easily dominate formal structures. But if it is a space for making unitary decisions, formality can be better to help people learn to make decisions in conditions of equality, though they should know that equality is always illusory, and to prevent the assembly from becoming dominated by an informal hierarchy. There will be some people who are better at controlling formal structures, and this is a danger, but being a heterogeneous space, and as such one with less trust, participants will not have an easy time making direct criticisms, which is the best weapon against informal hierarchies. Here, an important dynamic becomes visible. In a space of unitary decision-making, decisions that are applied to everyone with the idea that actions are also taken in a unified way, power is centralized, and thus the problem arises of the control of the assembly. In a decentralized space, one of coordination among autonomous groups and individuals, one of encounter, or one of voluntary adhesion to decisions, power is diffuse and the same problematic does not exist. Before moving on to the question of meta-organization, or larger-scale organization, something must be said about the historical debate between the formal and informal postures. Although the debate normally takes place in an unnecessary way, opposing two forms of organization, each with their advantages and disadvantages, as though we had to choose between them, it is the partisans of formality who have tended to err most. They often ignore the history of the large formal structures, with their betrayals and failures, and they often use demagoguery instead of lucid arguments, for example, blurring informality with the failure of formal structures. If the people in a formal organization do not carry out the commitments they have formally engaged, or if they continue to create informal hierarchies, this is not an example of informality, but a failure of formality. Beyond individual projects exists the question of meta-organization, the organization of organizations, and the pretension of large-scale organization. It is here that the criterion of density takes on a critical importance. When we speak of density, we are referring to the frequency, intensity, and proximity of anarchist activity, including all the individual projects we have just mentioned. Too often, proposals for more organization are raised in anarchist deserts, regions with little activity or few anarchists, or anarchist swamps, regions with many anarchists but who are inactive or in a rut, for example, Barcelona after the fall of the new popular movements. These are destined to fail. Organization itself does not generate more activity if there is nothing to organize. On the contrary, it spends a great deal of energy to constitute structures that will be immobilizing from the beginning. There are few things sadder than an anarchist mass organization or platform with 5 to 15 members in an entire country, like those that have appeared from time to time in the UK, the Balkans, North and South America. It is also sad to see dozens of comrades dedicating so much time to building a large organization while they go missing in their work in the neighborhood, subversion in the workplace, and in the fight in the streets. Meta-organization, with few exceptions, only makes sense when there is a high anarchist density. In those moments, comrades who had previously always opposed initiatives for large organizations will change their ideas and begin to support one or another initiative, hopefully without losing their early critique, as has happened in Catalonia or Greece. When many anarchist projects exist in the same region, organization can amplify their force and help them overcome previously insurmountable problems and limitations, opening new dimensions of struggle. Or, organization can cause them to centralize, abandon their prior terrains of struggle, and become asphyxiated by the demands of unity. A text of the recent initiative of the Gathering of Libertarian Infrastructures gives an example of what opening another dimension of struggle could mean. In Catalonia, there are many constructive projects, like gardens, workshops, print shops. Individually, each one has to fend for itself, usually searching for the means of survival within democratic legality and the capitalist market, and sometimes falling into the ideologies of the same when they begin to support alternativism, the use of money, and the production of ethical merchandise. By coordinating, they would create the possibility of developing a gift economy, putting anarchic relations in practice, and becoming a more integral part of the struggles. Another example, hypothetical but based in real experiences, would be a country where there are multiple prisoner support groups. Organizing together, they could share resources and experiences, avoid the duplication of work, and ensure that no prisoner goes without support and that all the aspects of support are sufficiently elaborated. The fact that the initiatives of coordination are posterior to the existence of the individual projects is a great help, because it demonstrates that each group already has a real practice and a capacity for self-organization. Having opened their own path, each group will have diverse and autonomous perspectives. On the contrary, initiatives and projects that arise from a large organization are like houses built from the roof down. They will lack an already developed activity and experience of their own. Most likely, they will be phantasmal. If the appropriate density to initiate meta-organization is present, what form should it take? The encounter is the most informal option. It functions like an assembly or an array of diverse spaces that galvanizes the links between the people and the projects that constitute it. It is structured to facilitate self-organization between participants, multiple of whom can initiate a joint structure without everyone having to participate. In other words, it functions by adhesion. It can be a space of debate, but not of consensus, beyond a consensus on certain minimums. Proposals can be made in the encounter, but with the aim of looking for complicities and not arriving at a unitary decision among everyone. It is a decentralized structure par excellence. Its advantages are that it does not present the danger of centralization or bureaucratization. It is a very fluid and lightweight organization that activates the potential of the participants' will and that dies the moment that they stop dedicating energies to it. Its disadvantages are that it does not enable unified action or the preparation and planning of campaigns or activities among everyone, in those moments when it seems necessary to do so. In such a case, it might have to function as an assembly, which might or might not work given the number of participants and the degree of difference among them. The coordination is formal, but also places great emphasis on the autonomy of its members. It can serve to share resources and proposals, by adhesion or in a decentralized way, and also to plan unitary actions and campaigns. The participants can be individuals and collectives, or only collectives, but the coordination is distinct from an assembly or collective because it is a focal point for multiple forces, and the force available to it surpasses that of all the individuals present in the space. It is also assumed that its participants have their own struggles, resources, and networks. Planning and the coordination can be carried out by work groups, in the assembly itself if it is not too large, or member collectives can bring proposals that have already been elaborated. In any case, a process of delegation exists to communicate proposals between the central assembly of the coordination and the collectives that compose it. In a coordination, participants can organize debates, but it is not such a common activity, given that they are not seeking greater unity, as in a federation, nor a deepening of relationships, as in an encounter, but a pragmatic contact for concrete activities. The federation is formal and centralized. To be a true federation, it needs at least 3 organizational levels: that of the local groups, an intermediate level for groups in the same area or region, and a high level that includes all the groups. Nonetheless, some very reduced federations only have the first and third level. Footnote: there are also various affinity groups, assemblies, or coordinations that call themselves federations owing to an organizational fetish. End footnote. Parallel to the assemblies or plenums at each level, there can also be a secretariat or committee. This greatly augments the bureaucracy and the danger that it becomes an authoritarian organization, as has been the case for much of the trajectory of the CNT, the largest anarchist federation in history. But such structures can be necessary to give consistency and agility to the work of the organization. If the federation is anarchist, the posts in the secretariat and committee will be rotating and revocable. In order to function as a federation, all the local groups that comprise it must be symmetrical. For example, they must all be neighborhood assemblies or syndicates or free schools, etc. If not, the federation is illusory. Footnote: leaving aside the possibility of a confederation of federations, each of which organize base groups of a different type. These groups are not autonomous, rather they aim for a certain unity, and the contact between them is not flexible. Rather, it aims to be long-term or permanent. Unlike a coordination, the federation can create new participant groups and change the way in which the base groups relate. It works by delegation. Although the plenums might be open to all members in order to encourage transparency, each participant group must speak with one voice, an artificial imposition that comes with authoritarian tendencies, given that no human group is truly homogeneous. If one were to sketch the organizational schema of a federation, the result would be a triangle. The horizontal line contains all the base groups. In the middle are the intermediate levels of organization, successively narrower, and the tip is the central space that unites the whole federation, the superior assembly with its committees or secretariat, if there is one. It is vital, from an anarchist perspective, that the tip of this triangle is on the bottom and not on the top, because the triangle with the tip on the top is also the organizational schema of the state. What does all this mean, beyond cliches? That the most important organizational level and the concentration of force must reside among the local groups, and that the Central Assembly must have limited importance and frequency. For example, a large part of the initiatives could arise from the local groups, reaching the intermediate levels and from there spreading to other local groups. The local groups could be self-sufficient in a large part of their activity and only go to the higher levels to seek resources or amplify their results, instead of always waiting for the campaigns and directives set out by the central level. We can compare two federations of interest for anarchists. The Haudenosaunee, or Six Nations, are a confederation of 6 indigenous nations in North America, among them the Mohawk and the Oneida. Their confederation is more than 700 years old, and it has served to resist various attempts to impose state authority. The CNT is the most potent and effective confederation anarchists in the West have erected in their history. Within 26 years, it turned into a hierarchical organization, imposing state authority on a large part of the lower classes in Spain, where state power had been negated in the insurrection of July 1936. In a wide territory, governmental authority had disappeared, replaced by self-organization. The CNT, above all its local groups and lower levels, initiated part of this self-organization, but another part was spontaneous, whereas the leaders of the CNT stopped the expropriations and collectivizations that were opposed by the government. Only the CNT was capable of re-establishing state authority in the free zones, or impeding an insurrection when the communists and Republicans crushed the free zones, by way of the anti-fascist politics of the Popular Front. The difference between the two federations, the successful one and the failure, is that the local groups of the Haudenosaunee were villages or communal houses with a high degree of self-sufficiency, and that the importance, the strength, lay in what Westerners would call the lower levels of the federation, while in the CNT it was the other way around. It was the statewide congresses and committees that exercised power. Among the Haudenosaunee, no one occupies a post in the central level, and the assemblies of the totality of the Confederation occur irregularly in cases of need, which is to say, the central or superior level of the Federation normally does not exist. Another difference is that the societies that compose the Haudenosaunee are more or less anti-patriarchal, with differences between one nation and another, while the CNT was clearly an organization of men, even though women played a vital role in the contemporary struggles. If comrades in a specific place decide, with lucidity and a studied familiarity with our history, that the degree of tight coordination made possible by a federation is advantageous or necessary, they should go right ahead. But it is vital that they never seek to be an all-absorbing organization, that they maintain a certain equality and solidarity with the revolutionaries, anarchist and otherwise, who stay outside the organization. A federation can be powerful, but it is the most dangerous organization from an anarchist viewpoint. In Greece, probably the country with the greatest anarchist density, there are currently 2 federations in the process of creating themselves. It seems to be a good signal that both of them pose the question of how to relate with the extensive sectors of the anarchist space that does not participate in either federation. Neither of them seek to include or absorb the whole of anarchist activity. Next steps. To have any possibility of destroying this prison society and averting the horrible destiny that is unfolding around us, it is indispensable to stop conceiving of our weakness in terms of dissemination, to abandon the practice of recruitment and the delirium of mass organization that it represents, and to energetically criticize those currents that make use of marketing and populism. But much more than attacking our errors, we have to mark other paths to follow, with actions more than with words. To start with, it cannot be a single path. No one practice is capable of including all the activities necessary for our revolution. We must think of revolt as an ecosystem. If we try to be the only species, we kill the revolution. But, in whatever form, we must all start posing the question of survival. This means that the projects and activities we encourage and amplify through organization should concern themselves with the self-organization of life, that they should be useful for us as well as for other people, that they should support and augment our capacities of struggle, understanding struggle as a basic aspect of survival for people who desire liberty, and that they should take into account the possible changes in the capitalist system, from collapse to a profound transformation in the architecture of the world system. We should also seek out initiatives of synthesis, which confuse the categories of capitalist alienation and join distinct forces in order to overcome the typical divisions that the dogmatic anarchists, from the populists to some of the antisocial anarchists, only reinforce. To speak concretely, this synthesis might take the form of a network of social and antisocial comrades, of artists and theorists, of those with a propensity for care and those with a propensity for the attack, who admire the skills and capacities of the others, who don't insult one another behind their backs, who use their talents not to boost egos or achieve personal advancement, but for the benefit of all, who conceive of themselves as a community of struggle and search for a complementarity in their actions, not always agreeing, but maintaining a basic feeling of solidarity, mutual aid, and respect. Projects that increase our capacity for struggle might take the form of a healthcare group that offers its skills to people injured in protests or comrades coming out of prison, of rural projects, those that often end up isolated, that act as spaces for gatherings, for rest, and also for physical work for the urban assemblies that maintain an unsustainable rhythm, of combative comrades who risk their bodies and their freedom, not to target enemies who are often symbolic, although also a necessary activity, albeit limited, but to defend a garden, a clinic, a house, or a social center against eviction. Of a group specialized in propaganda and dissemination, helping to spread the most radical, provocative, and marginalized ideas. Of networks of people who manage to meet ever more of their needs without resource to monetized commercial relations, not running from conflict with capitalism, but inviting more people to join them in their mutiny. As a Mapuche comrade said, explaining a project for generating electricity in a community in resistance, we don't want to generate our own electricity just to achieve self-sufficiency. By making our own electricity, we can attack and sabotage the infrastructures of the state and the companies that occupy our territory, infrastructures we currently depend on. That's what is meant by amplifying our capacities of struggle. And since the revolt is an ecosystem, each of us has our own role. Separation in different ideological currents, normally indicative of differences in character and not lucid critical theories, is another function of capitalist alienation in our own spaces. Those who dedicate themselves to the attack have not been able to maintain it in the face of repression. Those who do not dedicate themselves to the attack have not avoided their own pacification. Those who have gone to the countryside have not left capitalism behind. Those who stayed in the city have not been able to plant any seeds in the cracks they have opened in the asphalt. We have to put these distinct tendencies in common again, so that a creative and fecund tension exists between them. The paths that have already been marked out only lead to a horrifying future. In conclusion, we have shared an evaluation of the current stagnation of the anarchist movement. We've considered the need for anarchists to seriously position ourselves with respect to certain global forces, the total transformation of society by emerging technologies, and the geopolitics of anti-terrorism. We have looked at possible outcomes of the crisis in capitalism and how these might affect the strategies we use. In order to meet all these challenges, to break out of stagnation, to spread anarchic relations, to influence the outcome of social conflicts, and to stake a position outside the sterile contest between democracy and terrorism, I have proposed using a chaotic, pluralistic, ecosystemic vision of revolt and society in order to organize our activity in a way that opens new dimensions of struggle and avoids the dangers of centralization, in order to seek complementarity and creative conflict between different currents rather than trying to impose unity, and to reframe our activity as the reconquest of life, with all the concrete skills and questions of survival that entails, rather than as the production or negation of abstractions, dissemination, recruitment, ideological purity, etc. May these words serve for further debate and the honing of our practices.